Now let's talk a little bit about what the EU medical devices regulation really is. So the MDR is the regulatory approval framework for medical devices that are being placed on the market within the European Union. Now this excludes in vitro devices, as those are covered by a separate regulation, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Now this is a very large regulation. It's not, as small as some of the other ones that we've seen, but it's also not as large as the REACH regulation, so at least there's that. But we're still talking about 123 articles in 10 chapters, 17 annexes, and 175 pages. So this is not something that you can quickly and easily come up to speed on. It's something that's going to take some time to learn and analyze and prepare for. Looking a little bit at the timeline here, the regulation was adopted on April 5th, 2017, and published into the official journal on May 5th, 2017. Now, as with most European regulations that are published in the official journal, it became effective 20 days after publication, which means that it became effective on May 25th, 2017. So what we see here, though, is that we talked about how in vitro devices are not included within the scope of this regulation, and that's because it was released with its sister regulation, the IVDR, or the in vitro medical device regulation. And what the IVDR does is it kind of separates the in vitro equipment requirements. So we don't have to consider those for the MDR. And this is important because, as you can see down below, the MDR has a 3-year transition while the IVDR has a 5-year transition.
On April 23, 2020, the European Council and Parliament adopted Regulation 2020-561, amending the European Medical Devices Regulation to postpone the application dates for most provisions by 1 year until May 2021. The IVDR application date remains the same.
So this is why today we're focusing on the MDR, because the Medical Devices Regulation is going to hit us first, right? And it's the most critical one to get up to speed on. We'll have a little bit more time to address the in vitro devices, but for now, we're going to focus on MDR. So when we look at, okay, so the MDR, we have the timeline, but how does it relate to the existing regulations we're currently working with? Well, companies that make medical devices right now are probably either working with either the Medical Device Directive or the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive, depending on what type of product it is. Now, the MDR is going to replace both of these. So regardless of which directive you're using, you're going to have to move to the new MDR moving forward. The IVDR, which is the one that comes into effect 2 years later, is replacing the In Vitro Diagnostic Medical Devices Directive. So it's basically replacing a previous version of itself. Notice that these are regulations, though they're not directives. They're replacing directives, but they're regulations. There's a little bit of a difference from a enforcement perspective and a management perspective, and that a directive is actually just that. It's a directive by the European Union, and all the individual member states within the union then have to enact national legislation, which is the actual laws that you meet, right? So a directive isn't a law. It's a directive for the member states to create laws, right? Whereas a regulation is actually an EU-centric law and can be enforced at the EU level. Okay, so there's a big difference between directives, which are legislated and enforced at the member state level, versus regulations, which are legislated and enforced at the EU level. Now, of course, the member states still have the responsibility of enforcing those, but it's just kind of a legal difference. Now, when we look at the existing certificates we have for the MDD, the AIMD, or the IVMDD even, we can see that we can use those to place products on the market until 2024. So we saw, when we go back here, we saw that, well, MDR becomes mandatory in 2020, 3-year transition, right? But we have until 2024 to use those to place them on the market. That's because these certificates have a lifespan, right? They're good for 4 or 5 years sometimes. So that's why that is in place, right? Because you get to play out the certificates. So they'll stop issuing the certificates, but you have to stop using them for placing on the market by May of 2024. And then you can no longer use those certificates to place products and service after 2025, like for high-risk items, right? So there's 2 sets of dates that we're tracking here, where when the certificates themselves are no longer applicable to be used, and when you can actually get their certificates, which is with the implementation dates we see here.
Learn more by viewing the full-length video online at greensofttech.com/videos. Plus, learn about our environmental regulation solutions online at greensofttech.com.